Hi everyone, I'm Gwen from Nile. Nile is serverless Postgres for modern SaaS. And as you all know, SaaS applications are multi-tenant. So Nile provides what we call tenant virtualization. The idea is that you can think of every tenant as if it lives in its own virtual database, which lets you do things like backup a single tenant or place a tenant in different infrastructure, maybe a whole different region. This gives you security and isolation, and it also gives you a lot of flexibility in how you manage your tenants without having to deal with a lot of tricky scripts and weird access rules. Now, the cool thing is that even though you can think of every tenant as its own database, you still get all the experience that you're used to from having a single Postgres instance. So you don't have to deal with all the operational overhead of managing hundreds or thousands of databases. If it sounds complicated, don't worry. In this 10-minute video, I'm going to walk you through a real-world example of building SaaS on Nile that benefits from all the tenant isolation and virtualization that we just talked about. I'll show you how to create a Nile database, and then I'll show you an example application, and we'll walk you through from start to finish how it works and how I built it, so you can go on and build your own really cool SaaS. Okay, so to get started, we need database. So let's get into Nile. And let's create a fresh database for this one. Okay, and it's going to be a charming dog. Okay, so once the database is created, the first thing you'll see is that we have a tenants table. Now, you did not create this table. It's a built-in table in Nile, so we provide it. And the idea is that tenants are, as we know, at the core of any SaaS application. So we know you're going to need it. We know that they're going to have names. We made some guesses about other stuff you'll need, and here it is for you. So this is pretty useful. There are other built-in tables, so you can look for them in Nile's documentation. Now, to build our own app, we obviously need our own table. So first thing we do is create a table. And it's a to-do table because we're building a to-do app. Okay, table was created, and now you can see it over here as well, and you can see all the columns. And you can see that it has tenant ID column. And this is what makes the table tenant aware. And Nile provides all the cool tenant virtualization capabilities on top of tenant aware tables. So every row in the table will have its own tenant ID, meaning it belongs to a specific tenant, which means that it's in a specific virtual tenant database. And when you do things for that virtual tenant database, it will be done on those rows. So we'll get there later when we look at the code for the example, but this is the main concept. And when I say tenant-aware table, now you know what I mean. Okay, so this is pretty much all we have to do really in the UI. One last bit before we move to cloning repositories and looking at the application is that we need to be able to connect to this database. So we need to collect some of the information. So we're going to need pretty much all of it. So let's start copying stuff. It's amiable car workspace. And then this is the workspace and database. And then we also need credentials for entering the database itself. So this will be username and password. Let's click on generate credentials. And again, we copy it. We save them. Okay, so we're done setting things in Nile console. Let's move to the command line. First thing is that we need to clone the example. So I'm going to clone the repository and then cd into the directory with this example. So now we have cloned the repository. We are in the project directory. Next thing is to create the environment file. So let's start by copying over. We have an example environment file and we're going to copy it and populate it. Okay, so this is where we put the values we copied earlier. So our workspace, and over here we put the credentials. Now, something important to pay attention to is that all those variables that start with next public, NextJS will potentially expose them to the client. So anyone with a browser who uses your SaaS application will be able to see them. While those that don't have next public, these stay in the backend. So you can put secret things there, like your database username and password, and they're going to stay safe. So keep that in mind as you are deciding what to use where. Okay, and now that we have the environment, next steps is to do npm install. This will get us all the dependencies. And we'll start the app. Okay, so you can see here our example application. And let's just take a quick look around to see how things look, right? So we can sign up, and you can really sign up with any users that you want. Let's go with that. We don't do any email validation because it's a small example. Okay, and once you sign up, it logs you in automatically. And the first screen you see is the tenant selector. So this is where you can create a tenant or select existing ones. Okay, and once you have a tenant, you can start creating to-dos. Okay, cool. So all this is an application backed by Nile database. So if we go back to the Nile console and go to the query editor, we can actually see all the users that we just created and the tenant and all that. So I'm doing here a small join, basically checking the to-dos for the tenants in this database. Okay, and you can see that we have a new tenant and the first task, exactly what we created in the UI. So this is a proof that the application works. Now, let me show you how it works, because that's the interesting and educational part. So I'm going to bring up my code editor. Okay, so the first place that a Next.js app starts is the root page, which is the home page. And over here, we don't do much except display the login screen. And I'm not going to go over the login flow because that will be another video. But once you log in the login screen, basically the flow lands you in the tenants page. So this is in the tenants directory, there is a page. This is the tenant selector that we talked about. And how does the tenant selector work? Well, it has to show a list of tenants, right? Which means that it has to query the database for that. Now, Next.js is kind of cool or horrible, depending on whether or not you like it. But the way it works is that it actually allows me to mix running my queries with how I display them, and it's in one page, and it makes the calls, what to do on the server, what to send to the client. And in my opinion, it actually works really well, especially for demos, because you have everything next to each other. So to go over how it works, basically in the first line here, we configure Nile. And we configure Nile. To configure Nile, we set authentication data from the client. This is because the user already logged in. And then the second variable should be the tenant ID, except that we're in the tenant selector. We don't have a tenant ID yet, and this is fine. So we're getting a general database, but it's configured with the identity of the user who is currently logged in. And if you want to see how configure Nile works, it's over here in lib. So over here we have the server object. This is singleton, so we initialize it here and use it all over the application. And it includes the API client and a database connection pool. And all of this is configured from the environment file that you saw earlier. Now in configure Nile, we ask for an instance of the Nile object. And this instance also has the same API client, but we now configure it with the user authentication token, which we send to Nile every time we make an API call. And the database connection pool, it also is initiated with the user identity. But more important, if you have a tenant ID sent here, then you get a connection specifically for the virtual database for that tenant. This is how we get the list of tenants to display. And you can see that once we configured the Nile object, we can get the user ID from it. So we can have Nile user ID and so on. And that's what we use for the query. We show all the tenants for the user. We also have a create tenant button. So when you click the button, it runs, again, this is a bit of NextJS form actions magic that you can learn about from NextJS. But the main idea is that when you do create tenant, once again, we call configure Nile. This is because in NextJS, those are all independent things. They may run on a different server, it may run on the edge. It doesn't necessarily know that I already have a Nile object. So the way the Nile client SDK works is that if I already have a configured Nile, fantastic. It will get one out of the pool. It will use existing connection. I'll have exactly what I need. If it doesn't exist, also fantastic. It will connect to Nile and give me back the connection that was just created. So I'm getting this Nile connection again. And again, it doesn't have a tenant yet. So it's just with the user information. And then I get the tenant name from the form. And then I'm calling Nile and basically saying create tenant and giving the tenant name. Note that I don't have to say which user, but it's going to create a tenant and connect it to my user because it knows that I'm asking to create a tenant as this user. This is what the special connection gives us. So once we created a tenant, it lands us in the to-do list for this tenant. So once again, we have a page. And now we can configure Nile with the tenant ID. So it gets even better. So once we have a connection to Nile with this tenant, it's basically a connection to this specific virtual tenant database. So you're connected to a database that only contains data for this tenant, which means that when we query the database, I don't have to put a where clause. I can say, show me all to-dos. Why? No one else's data is in this database. It's just for this user, just for this tenant. So it's very safe. I don't have to worry about accidentally showing data. I don't have to do joins or complex where conditions. The code is pretty clean. And same thing when I call Nile's API and say get tenant. I don't have to say get tenant for this ID or anything. It knows which tenant I am, and it gives me the tenant that I am in right now. So it's very simple to work in the right context because by configuring Nile, I already have all the context set up for me. And similar thing when I'm creating and deleting to-dos. I set up the context, and then after I configure it, I can say in this connection to my virtual tenant database, insert a new to-do or update a new to-do. So you can see again that the update, it says where the to-do ID equals that to-do ID because I don't want to update all the to-dos, but I don't need to tell it which tenant to do the work for. It knows exactly which tenant I'm in and which tenant I want to update. So this is the magic of Nile and also the magic of NextJS, which does a bunch of the heavy lifting here, allowing me to basically call a server-side serverless function from my forms. And it's pretty cool. So I import the function here, and then I say I have this form, and I say, okay, when I click on the checkbox, call complete to do, and I don't need to do fetch and handle the APIs or anything like that. It does it for me. Especially for demos, I think it just looks really nice. So here we are. And that's it. You have a really nice, small, to-do application, multi-tenant, running on Nile. As the next steps, first of all, if you haven't done it yet, I really encourage you, go clone the repository, take a look at the example on your own, play with it, try things, see if you can use those ideas to build your own SaaS application. If you run into any issues or have any concerns, you can always find Team Nile on our community Discord and on GitHub. After that, I hope you will build amazing SaaS on Nile.